Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we're reading the book entitled Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica Veith. This is an ebook available online for free at clashofminds.com, where you can download it and read along with us. Sonica Veith is the spouse of well-known evangelist, lecturer, university professor, and zoologist Dr. Walter Veith. And this true story is a chronicle of their life together, their ministry, their numerous trials, tribulations, and hardships, as well as their successes, victories, and triumphs. In our last reading, we covered chapter 4, entitled Groping in the Darkness. Many dramatic events took place in this chapter. First, Sonica's parents ended up divorcing. Then Walter got a job at his alma mater, and they returned to Stellenbosch, where they were fairly close to Walter's father. By this time, they had 2 children and wanted to give his dad and stepmom the opportunity to see the grandchildren. The stepmom made it so difficult that they had to meet his dad at a hotel. And then for a week, they couldn't contact him. And then when they finally got through, they discovered that his father seemed to have lost his mind. It turned out that he had a tumor in his brain that couldn't be operated on, and that he would only have a few months to live. They took him to live with them, and shortly after his death, although Walter was an executor on his will, the stepmother so arranged things that it ended up in an expensive legal battle, which Walter lost and had to pay all costs, while the stepmom ended up with mostly everything. Strangely, though, she unexpectedly died shortly after. Next, Sonica's father and his new wife Merle, the often divorced mother of her childhood friend Ivan, moved to a resort area close to the Cape. Because the father's job was close to their home and quite a ways from his home, he would spend the week with them and return home on weekends. It was going quite well, and the kids enjoyed their grandfather. However, it turned out that his new wife was a New Ager, teaching the book A Course in Miracles, which led men and women to believe they were like God and that they could work miracles. After this, they were very uncomfortable with her dad's relationship with her stepmom. Then Sonica had her 3rd child, Robert. During her pregnancy, she was always sick, feverish, weak, and asthmatic. Robert was a difficult child, always screaming and fighting, so that she had to tie him to prevent him from hurting himself or everyone and everything around him. Then, when he was about 1.5, something very strange happened. At 2 a.m., Walter awoke, gasping for breath and terrified that someone was strangling him. At the same time, Robert screamed a blood-curdling scream, unlike his usual bedtime screamings. Then he developed a raging, uncontrollable fever, and they had to rush him to the hospital, where no cause could be found. This happened a number of times, always at 2 a.m. And finally, Walter could take it no more. Remembering that a Catholic priest had resolved their last supernatural issue, he went back to the closest Catholic church and met a priest who dismissed him, saying that he didn't deal with those matters and he would tell someone else of his problem. In an even stranger turn of events, an older Catholic priest called him a few weeks later, but seemed to know all about their situation and had already received permission from the bishop to deal with it. He came to the house mixed salt with water, and made salty crosses on each window, held a mass, left them with some amulets to put over the kids' beds and their own, and a cross for Robert's bed. That night, Robert slept peacefully for the first time in his life. In the following months, nothing further happened, and they were perplexed but relieved. Dear listeners, please don't forget that you can download this book for free at clashofminds.com and read along with us as we pick up the story today with chapter 5, entitled Into the Light. Isaiah 58, verse 8. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thine health shall spring forth speedily. It is amazing what a lack of sleep can do to one's mind. But more amazing is what enough sleep can do. Now that we had no more nocturnal escapades, other than the usual occasional disturbances not unfamiliar to those who have taken upon themselves the daunting task of raising little human creatures, we suddenly felt that we had a life once more. One day, we were setting the table for lunch, and we kept on bumping into one another, trying to squeeze through the narrow doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. "This wall has to go," Walter threatened. "No, it doesn't." I knew his German temperament meant business, and that meant lots of trouble for me. "Yes, it will have to go," he said with finality. After lunch, he climbed into the ceiling to check the position of the roof beams, and without warning, started bashing down the kitchen wall with a 12-pound hammer. I hurried to save my entire kitchen, all breakables, pots and pans and utensils, from the devastating blows and bricks and mortar flying through the air. Within a few hours, I had a mountain of rubble on my dining room carpet and broken and messed up kitchen cupboards and surfaces. "We'll just have to put in a new kitchen at some time," Walter said, as he mused with satisfaction over the large space he had created. "At some time," I mumbled to myself. "We can now walk straight from the kitchen to the dining room. Isn't that nice, wifey?" He beamed like a little boy who had just built his first paper plane. Wifey wasn't impressed. Nice for whom? I thought, as I wondered how on earth I was going to cook for us. As I turned my eyes to the other side of the room, I saw 3 little gray figures standing quietly in the door. Their hair and clothes were covered in a thick layer of dust, and they looked like little gray old gnomes. We couldn't help laughing, and started to enjoy the idea of a change in the home, even though I had to spend the next few months cooking on gas cookers in the garage. Walter's kitchen inspiration bubbled over into the rest of the house, and before I knew it, my whole house was full of holes and rubble. We could smell and taste dust all day long, but the reward was worth the suffering. We were slowly transforming our tiny dollhouse into a semi-mansion with a swimming pool, patios with pergolas, and generous splashes of colorful ground covers cascading down the rocky slopes. One cold, rainy morning, I heard the bulldozer start up. The previous day, the earth-moving contractors had pushed over a wall at the back of our house so we could extend the house and put a swimming pool for those sweltering summer days. I suddenly realized that the huge earth-gobbling machine was headed toward my flower bed, and I ran out to save my precious plants. There was no time to fetch a garden fork, and I started digging with my hands into the earth under the ground cover and shrubs to loosen the roots. The next minute, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. I peered carefully into the bushes and saw something brown and coiled moving slowly deeper into the shadows of the plants. My stomach turned as I realized that I had been bitten by a snake. I ran back into the house, my mind racing to try and remember the correct procedure for snakebite. Although we had school holidays and the children were at home, Walter still had to be at the university. I called out to our eldest son Martin to phone his dad and tell him what had happened. Within 5 minutes, Walter managed to be home, a trip which usually took him 15 minutes. He had driven through the red traffic lights and stopped streets and over pavements, ignoring the threats and indignant looks he received from the other motorists and pedestrians. We phoned our doctor, who met us at the local small-town hospital. My hand was burning and my arm was turning bluish, but fortunately, it seemed that the snake was asleep when I disturbed it and wasn't able to get a firm grip on my hand. There was only a small hole in my middle finger and a little scratch just over a centimeter apart. By the spacing between the two fangs, the experts postulated that the snake must have been either a Cape cobra or a puff adder, both extremely poisonous snakes. The venom for the cobra affects the nervous system, and that of the puff adder causes cell degeneration, and the flesh of the affected limbs will slowly start to rot away. The doctor was in a dilemma. The correct anti-serum must be administered, or else the antidote can cause the victim's death. Then my eyes started drooping, which was symptomatic of the neurotoxin of a cobra. But first, I had to be tested for any allergic reaction. After a few seemingly endless minutes, the test indicated that I seemed to be slightly allergic, but the doctor made a calculated split-second decision and injected me with the life-saving fluid. I was rushed to a larger hospital where they had a respirator and were able to monitor me efficiently. During the trip in the ambulance, I must have lost consciousness, but I was told that we almost didn't reach the hospital. Our country was still politically in turmoil, and sporadic riots and necklace murders along our roads had become part of our daily life. As the ambulance took a shortcut to the hospital, we turned into a road that was blocked by hundreds of rioters. They attacked the vehicle and started to rock it in their usual attempt to overthrow it. Then Walter shouted to the driver, "Put your foot down! Just go, go, go!" The bewildered ambulance driver dug his foot deep into the accelerator and sped away. The mob parted like the Red Sea during the Exodus as the people scattered out of the way, and we were saved from certain death. During the following 3 days, I slipped in and out of a coma-like state. Sometimes I was aware of what was going on around me, but I was unable to move or speak or even open my eyes. I could hear the doctor enter the room and ask the sister who was sitting at my bedside how I was doing. She would answer and say that she was worried that I was still sleeping all the time. I wanted to shout that I wasn't sleeping, but I couldn't, and wondered whether I was permanently paralyzed. Or worse, I was worried that they would think I was dead and then bury me alive. But after a few days, I recovered quickly and was able to go home where our children were waiting, their faces pale with anxiety. After my encounter with our unwanted venomous garden boarder, I wore gloves and boots and used garden tools like a sensible gardener. Soon we had our garden looking even more beautiful than before, but I still didn't have a kitchen. Now, the search was on for the best kitchen designer. We phoned around and came across a cabinet maker in the Strand. And when my husband heard that he was German, the decision was made. Germans are best in everything they do. We'll take him. I merely lifted my eyebrows at that statement, mumbling inaudibly to myself, yes, they're also best at being conceited, it seems. The next day, a dark-haired man arrived to take the measurements. He was efficient and businesslike, not entirely a typical German, and different to those we were usually involved with. The typical German would go to the Kegelbahn, play skat for hours, and eat bockwurst and sauerkraut while downing one Stiefel beer after the other. Yes, this German was very different. One day, when he came to install some units, he said to us in a by-the-way manner, "I would like to say that I walk with the Lord. He's the partner in my business." And with that, he handed Walter a pamphlet. Oh, brother, not one of those Jesus freaks again, he thought. I looked at Walter, reading his predictable mind, and cringed at the thought that he might say what he was thinking. He took a brief glance at the paper in his hand and said, "That's fine by me. You walk with whomever you want, but I just want a kitchen." Then he opened a nearby drawer and gratefully flicked the pamphlet inside, out of sight, and changed the subject. At long last, the home was finished. And as we started enjoying the luxury of having so much space, a strange feeling of guilt crept out from under the covers of our nightmare past. We were basking in the sunlight of a trouble-free life without giving credit to the one who seemingly created the sun, the Catholic Church. Twice they had solved our problem with the spirit world, and now we had to reciprocate, or we feared the blessing would turn into a curse. We had sold our holiday house in Vermont, and after discussing the matter, we decided to donate some money to repair the roof of the church, which was in a pitiful state. With that conscience-soothing decision, Walter rushed down to the church to hand the priest the check. But to his surprise, the man, without a word of gratitude, took the check as if it were worth no more than a piece of paper, and said he would hand it over to his superior. Disappointed that he didn't get some form of absolution from something, or at least some accolades, Walter drove back home, still feeling guilty. What more are we supposed to do to earn our sunshine? A few weeks later, the guilt had driven Walter to the point where he decided to start going back to church. To protect his family, he was even willing to go through the most terrifying childhood experience, the confessional. He couldn't imagine anything more humiliating for an atheist scientist than to sit in a stuffy box and whisper his heart's secrets to another man. Not to mention what that would do to his image. What if a student sees him at church? That would, without doubt, destroy his professional credibility. Fortunately, there was a solution to his dilemma. This solution was about 11 years old at the time. If someone should ask, Walter thought, I could easily say I was taking my oldest son to church. Martin was always willing to please, and the following Sunday, he accompanied his father for the first time in his life to church. And during the week, he attended catechism classes. Soon it had become a way of life. And besides, it wasn't that much of a sacrifice. They would go to church in their squash clothes, and after Mass, we would all go down to the squash club to play a few games with our friends and drink beer. I even started attending church from time to time, although I just observed and didn't take part in all the ritual bowing, responsive readings, and the Hail Marys, and of course, I wasn't allowed to take part in the Mass because I wasn't Catholic. About a year later, Walter, in his usual passionate way, tried to explain to his large first-year class the intricacies of our origin, when a girl once again interrupted him and stood up in class. "Dr. Veith, I just want to say that I don't agree. I know that God created us, so how can this evolution theory be right?" Walter wasn't sure that he had heard right. How on earth could someone be so ignorant? How can anyone in this day and age still believe such a ridiculous myth? During the following minutes, he used a combination of his sarcastic, sharp tongue and all the wrath stored up since his childhood against God to humiliate the young girl in front of the whole class. When the students started sniggering, she sat down in a flushed state and started crying. Egged on by the response of the class, Walter reveled in his victory for a while and then continued with the class. Back in his office, the little nagging voice of his conscience started to plague him. "What a hypocrite you are," he said to himself. "You go to church because they helped you with a problem, but you refuse to admit there is a God." He was feeling increasingly unhappy about his behavior in class and decided to visit the priest. Maybe confessing, as much as he disliked it, would free him from his guilty feelings and he could get on with his life as usual. When he arrived at the parish, there was not a soul in sight. He stood around for a while and then entered the small dark chapel. The church was empty. Walter sat down in the pews and looked through the security bars that separated the altar area from the rest of the chapel. The little red light was shining, which meant that the host, which had been transformed by the priest into the actual body of Christ, was in its holy place. He suddenly felt very uncomfortable and confused with the idea that an intelligent, thinking adult could believe that God was locked up in a little box behind bars, and then only when the little red light was shining. Feeling disgusted with himself and everything around him, he stood up and said loudly, "God, how can I believe in you? If you really exist, you will have to show me." And with that challenge, he walked out of the church. A few days later, Walter was searching for something as usual. He wasn't much of an organized person and always relied on me to keep track of his misplaced items. To tell the truth, he hasn't changed much over the last 30 years. But I did. I don't try to keep track of his misplaced items any longer. "Where did you hide the manual for my angle grinder?" he shouted more than asked. I rolled my eyes. I wanted to say, "How should I know? Oh, I remember. I think I last used your angle grinder to carve the roast chicken." I giggled to myself, but I dared not frustrate him even further. Instead, like a well-trained wife, I hurried to help him look for it before he lost his temper completely. When I arrived in the kitchen, he had pulled open every cupboard and drawer and was ruffling through some papers in the top drawer. He pulled out a pamphlet and started reading it silently, turning it over a couple of times. "What is it?" I asked, thankful for the distraction. "Remember that guy gave it to us when he came to install the kitchen cupboards?" he said musingly. I looked at the pamphlet for the first time. It was written in German, and on the inside there were the simple words, "The Catholic Church changed the commandments of God." Underneath were 3 columns of different versions of the 10 Commandments. The first, the biblical version. The second, the Catholic. And the third was the Lutheran version. We looked at each other, and an indescribably strange but serious feeling gripped my heart. I didn't understand what the significance was, but I knew this was something important. "Where's Martin's catechism book? I want to check this out," Walter said, as he kept on staring at the paper in his hand. I fetched our son's lesson book, and we discovered that the Catholic 10 Commandments were exactly as described on the pamphlet. "Do we have a Bible in the house?" he asked. We searched all of our bookshelves, but found nothing. Then Walter remembered Tante Kippel. For many years, Walter's father had visited the old German lady in a wheelchair, and after his death, we continued to visit her and take her out. When she died, she left all her belongings to us, 1 box full of books and a few odds and ends. Walter hurried to the garage where he had stacked away the box, rummaged through the items, and pulled out a little, well-read Bible. With an unusual urgency, he scanned the Bible for Exodus 20 and discovered that the 10 Commandments were indeed different from the Catholic version, just as indicated on the pamphlet. The Lutheran Church's version was exactly the same as the Catholic commandments, even though Tante Kippel's old Lutheran Bible told a different story. Comparing the 2 sets of commandments, we discovered that the second commandment, which forbade bowing down and worshiping idols, was removed entirely, and in order to have 10 again, the last command, which forbids coveting anything someone else has, was split into 2 different categories of the same commandment, forbidding coveting your neighbor's wife, as well as coveting his goods. We further noticed with amazement that our son's catechism book spoke of the Sabbath day being the Sunday, the first day of the week, whereas the Bible refers to the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, which is the Saturday. We always thought that Sunday was the 7th day, but when we checked the calendar and the dictionary, it was clearly indicated that Sunday was the first day of the week. Why would they want to change something from the Bible? We wondered. Shouldn't the church doctrines be based on the Bible? Confused and eager to understand more, we decided to phone the man who had given us the pamphlet almost a year before and ask him what all this meant. Walter struggled to get through, but eventually the phone rang and the cabinet maker answered. When Walter explained to him that we would like to know more about what it said on the pamphlet, he said, "This is strange. After such a long time, I suddenly had the feeling I should phone you, but I couldn't get through because you were trying to phone me." They laughed, and Werner promised to pay us a visit after work. In the meantime, Walter had set off to buy us each an English Bible, not as lovely as the one that was stolen from me when I was a child, but it seemed good enough. That evening, Werner arrived, armed with his German Bible, and we sat down around the dining room table to discuss the questions we had. He explained to us how it was predicted in Daniel chapter 7 that after the fall of the great empires of the world, whereupon Europe would be divided, another power would arise that would eventually control all the nations and religions right until the end of time on this earth. All the characteristics of this power were spelt out more than 1,000 years before the appearance of this little horn, and the description fits only one possible political and religious entity, and that is the papacy. We were stunned about this information. Could it be that the church that delivered us from evil spirits and brought peace to our home was the Antichrist spoken of in the Bible? We talked almost right through the night until Werner's eyes looked like two great pools of blood. We were insatiable, and being by then no longer a full-blown atheist, but a good agnostic scientist, Walter decided to check the evidence with the theology and history departments at his university. He had everyone running around in circles trying to gather the information he needed, but eventually he had to admit that the facts so clearly depicted in the Bible were correct. Our studies of the Bible together with Werner continued throughout the next couple of nights. In no time, we had studied through the whole book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, where it clearly predicts what will happen on earth at the time of the end, and even beyond the time on this earth as we know it. At every possible opportunity during the day, Walter and I would read and study as much as we could absorb, sometimes non-stop through the day and night. At this point, we decided to give the Catholic Church the opportunity to give their viewpoint, and Walter phoned the priest to ask him to visit us and explain why the Catholic Church changed the commandments of the Bible. To our surprise, the priest merely said, "I don't know. I'm not into Scripture." And that was the last we ever heard of him. Walter refused to give up and invited the ministers of some of the Protestant churches to explain their views on the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. Although they proved to be more into Scripture than the Catholic priest, they left totally bewildered and rattled after they saw some things in the Bible that their theological seminaries never taught them. We noticed, though, that our youngest son was becoming increasingly more restless. During the day, he would start crying as soon as we took up the Bible to read, and at night, he seemed to revert back to his fitful sleeping pattern. One day, after we had gobbled down our lunch during Walter's lunch break, we eagerly sat down in the lounge to study the Bible. Robert was playing quietly in the room with us when he found an empty wine bottle from the previous evening, and throwing it down onto the tiled floor, he proceeded to walk over the shattered glass, which resulted in him almost severing his big toe. Off to the doctor it was again, which put an unpleasant end to our studies for a while. We told our newfound friend about the incident, and after briefly explaining to him what we had gone through with Robert and how the priest had intervened, Werner said, "I will come tonight and show you in the Bible what happened to you and your son." That evening, we began to unravel a mystery that has plagued mankind since the beginning of time. What happened to people when they die And can we interact with the so-called departed spirits? Werner showed us a couple of texts in the Bible which clearly described that death is a state similar to sleep, during which the dead know nothing until the day that they are resurrected at the end of time. That is, when the rock in Daniel 2 strikes the prophetic feet of clay and iron, and God himself intervenes on the earth. In the meantime, the dead do not exist in an unseen realm, looking down on this earth, or even going back to their families and homes to change into a ghostly vapor, to scare or to communicate with the living. They don't even go to heaven or hell after death. Neither do they continue to exist in a Catholic place called purgatory, where they pay the price for sins already forgiven by a priest in order to be able to move on to heaven. Ecclesiastes 9, verses 5 and 6. For the living know they shall die, but the dead know not anything. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. Psalm 146 in verse 4. His breath goeth forth, he returneth to his earth. In that very day his thoughts perish. Walter and I looked at each other in disbelief. Then who is it that appears to people in the form of a ghost? And what is this poltergeist that throws things around in haunted houses? I asked anxiously. The Bible says that God's arch enemy, Satan, will deceive many people by pretending to be an angel of light. He and his evil angels will do great and wonderful things and can work through human beings to achieve their goals. They can pretend to be the deceased child of some bereaved parents and will even be able to impersonate that child 100%, appearance and voice, everything, Werner explained as he read to us 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. God also warned his people not to go to mediums and try to speak to the dead, because by doing so, they're opening a channel for Satan to enter into their lives. He continued as he paged to several texts in the Bible, such as Deuteronomy 18, verse 10, Jeremiah 27, verse 9, and Isaiah 8, verse 19. Does that mean that we spoke to demons when we played the Ouija board, and not to your mother? I asked Walter in disgust. Walter was silent, but Werner just nodded. It was as if scales had dropped from my eyes, and I continued excitedly. Now, if I understand it correctly, the Pope claims to be equal to or even higher than God. They changed God's commandments and persecuted God's faithful Bible-believing Christians throughout the ages. Therefore, they cannot be on God's side, but on Satan's side. Does that mean it wasn't God that worked through the priests from the Catholic Church to bring peace to our home, but Satan? Werner nodded again. I struggled to define that uneasy feeling again as Walter and I glanced at each other. Our German friend looked at his watch. It was after 12 already, and he got ready to leave. We thanked him for his time and said goodbye. We struggled to digest everything and wondered why the Catholic priest would want to go to all the trouble to exorcise demons if the Catholic Church is their undercover agent in the first place. Little did we know that in a few days we would have the answer to that question. We went to bed that night wondering how it was that a door had opened to such a remarkable and intriguing new episode in our lives. The next day, Robert was very ill. He hardly slept and had been running a temperature right through the night. All had been well, and now suddenly, this again. Later that day, Werner told us that a group of friends had been praying day and night for a week for Robert, but the previous night, one of the group thought the danger was over, so she didn't get up during the night for her turn to pray. This prayer thing was so new to us, and we didn't understand it fully, but we started to realize that it was something powerful, and that there must be a God and not a man nor an institution that had the power to protect us. A few days later, after almost a year of no contact, Father McAllen phoned Walter sounding desperate. "Dr. Veith, I have to speak to you urgently." "Yes, what is it? Is something wrong?" Walter felt his heart pounding in anticipation. "Well, you haven't been attending church for a while. It is of vital importance that you return as soon as possible and say a mass for your father who—" "My father?" Walter interrupted. "My father has been dead for a few years already." "I know, and that is why he needs you desperately. He's in great trouble on the other side. But if you would have the mass said for him, it would relieve his agony and—" Walter was beginning to get the picture. "And how do you know this?" he asked. The priest lowered his voice and said, "The nuns that never see the outside world told me. They have contact with the other side." Now, everything was as clear as crystal to us. For the first time, we understood how the old priest knew what was happening in our house more than a week before Walter even went to ask for help at the Catholic Church. The nuns that never see the outside world must have been having regular spiritualistic meetings during which demons provide them with information. And Walter's father, who was dead and sleeping according to the Bible, was neither in purgatory, nor in heaven, nor hell. Now, we also understood that the spiritual attack on us and the subsequent solving of the problem by the priest were intended to draw Walter and his whole family back into the snare of a false system of worship where Satan and his agents would be able to continue to deceive and harass us. I shuddered at the thought. The following evening, Werner brought a young pastor with him. He explained to us that Satan had had full control in our lives and that we needed to turn to the one and only true God, admit that we had been wrong, and place our family under his protection. Walter and I were asked to go to our bedroom and pray, while Werner and the pastor would pray in the lounge. In the bedroom, we looked at each other sheepishly. We had never prayed before. How does one do that? I found myself giggling nervously as we got down on our knees, wondering what our highly educated friends and family would think if they could see us now. After stammering through a few words of prayer, asking God to take control of our lives, we returned to the lounge. For the first time, the feeling of uneasiness and uncertainty was lifted. It was as if we had traveled all our life on cul-de-sac roads that lead to nowhere. And now, for the first time, we were on a highway. Although we still didn't know our destination, at least we knew we would somehow get there. There was, however, one giant hurdle: the Sabbath issue. We understood that Catholicism was the Antichrist by trying to act in the place of God on earth, by changing God's commandments and persecuting the faithful Christians throughout all the ages. But we didn't understand the significance of worshiping on a specific day, the seventh day. You say Genesis 1 speaks of God creating the earth in 6 literal days. That's impossible. Everyone knows that we came into existence through millions of years of evolutionary processes, Walter one day said to Werner. It's absolutely ridiculous to suggest that an organism as complicated as the human being was created by God speaking just a few words, he said, and proceeded to explain to the silent cabinet maker the intricacies of the mastermind called evolution. Not being a scientist, and wise enough not to argue with him, Werner calmly said, God created us and everything on this entire earth in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested and made it holy. Prove it, Walter interrupted. Those days in the Bible can't be 7 literal days. We need longer ages to explain how we got here. Prove to me it's literal. I'll bring you books to read, Werner said as he got up to leave. The next day, he returned with a pile of books, which Walter studied and returned promptly. I've never read so much rubbish in my life, he grunted with disgust as he shoved the pile of books into the arms of the surprised man. The following day, Werner returned again with another stack of books larger than the first, which Walter scanned in no time and returned with even more disdain than before. I really don't know how you can believe that nonsense. How can God expect people to acknowledge and commemorate the 7th day as a literal day if there is no proof that creation took place in 6 literal days? We all know that the fossils have been dated hundreds of thousands of years old, not to mention the millions of years for rocks. Is it really significant that the Pope changed the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday? You know, maybe the 6 days actually represent something like 6 million years. But how then could the whole world justify keeping 1 day holy instead of 1,000,000 years? No, that doesn't make sense either. How about if Walter babbled on as he tried to find a way out of this new challenge? Werner was slowly getting frustrated, and after a while, he suddenly interrupted and said, You know, I can't prove it to you, but I don't have a problem with the biblical creation account. You have the problem, so you solve it. And with that, he gathered his pile of library books and left. It wasn't often that someone managed to take the wind out of Walter's sails, but that day he was quiet, at least for a few blissful hours. During the next few weeks, a whole new world was open to us. It was like looking through 3D glasses. Suddenly, you find yourself walking through a dimension that was there all the time. But because of your limited vision, you never knew about it. One day, Walter brought a multi-page document home that someone at work had given him to read. Since he was too busy trying to sort out the confusion about creation and evolution, he absent-mindedly dumped the papers onto my lap. "Won't you just see what this is all about? I don't have time right now." The next morning, while the children were at school, Walter at work, and Robert playing quietly with his toys, I tackled the lengthy document, and after reading through the first few pages, I realized it was about the Saturday Sabbath. I wondered why Walter's colleague gave him this specific article. He hadn't told anyone about what had been happening in our lives, especially not that we had been studying the Bible. The writer attempted to prove that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday to commemorate Christ rising from the dead on the first day of the week. He proceeded to quote numerous priests and bishops from the Catholic Church who claimed that this change was a mark, a sign of their authority above God and the Scriptures. Not once did they refer to any Bible texts. Now I was really interested. I flipped open my new Bible, and a most remarkable thing happened. I paged from one section of the Bible to the next. It was as if the words Ten Commandments and Sabbath stood out more clearly than all the other words, almost as if written in bold. Every page I turned to happened to refer to either the commandments or the Sabbath, and in every instance, their importance and holiness were emphasized. After studying for a few hours, I pushed the document aside and closed my Bible. I had made my decision. The document that was supposed to turn the reader away from the Bible and the Sabbath that Jesus himself instituted and kept, convinced me that the biblical seventh day, Saturday, was the correct day of worship and not the Sunday. Walter's day turned out to be even more astounding. During his free period, he hurried down to the zoology department's library, which was probably one of the largest evolutionary-based libraries in the Southern Hemisphere. The librarian had stepped out for a few minutes, and Walter found himself standing in front of the rows and rows of books, not knowing where to start or even what he was looking for. In desperation, he mumbled, "God, I don't understand how the biblical account of our origins can be correct. But if the evolutionary theory is wrong, you will have to show me." He took a book from the shelf, signed it out, and walked towards his office. One of his colleagues approached him in the corridor from the front, but instead of just greeting him casually as usual, he crossed over towards Walter and asked about the book in his hand. "Why don't you take the new edition? It just arrived. Come, I'll show you." Stunned that a colleague in a department known for its fierce scientific rivalry should take an interest in him, he nevertheless followed him back into the library. Walter thanked the man, but not wanting to go through the process of signing the book in and out again, he decided to take both. In his office, he started to page through both books at the same time, comparing them page by page. To his amazement, he noticed that in many instances, where the old edition clearly admitted that there was a lack of evidence to prove certain assumptions, such as evidence for intermediary fossils between birds and reptiles, or the hippos and the whale, the new edition had removed all doubts, presenting the assumptions as facts. And if that wasn't enough, a few days later, a most remarkable thing happened. A visiting professor from the United States was to present a lecture at the zoology department, and the entire staff and students were expected to attend. Walter felt he had more important things to do and mumbled to himself as he impatiently waited for the speaker to begin. Then something strange happened. As the professor rummaged through his briefcase for his lecture, he looked up in disbelief and said, "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I seem to have misplaced the lecture I was to present to you. I must have left it at the hotel." He shook his head as he continued to search through his papers and slides and said apologetically, "I do, however, have another lecture with me, one of an anthropological nature. Would you like me to present this lecture? I really do apologize for the inconvenience." Since classes had already been cancelled in order to attend the lecture, the audience agreed to listen to the lecture, which, for most of the zoologists, seemed insignificant and boring. But as the lecturer continued to explain how the different races migrated and changed as they populated the earth in recent time frames, Walter suddenly realized that God was once again answering another question related to the accepted scientific views on long ages. According to science, evolutionary changes had to take place over millions of years, and in the case of the human being, over hundreds of thousands of years. But according to this professor and his research, the Aborigine, for instance, originated from Asia, and the changes in appearance and structure took place within approximately 4,000 years. Walter was amazed. He now realized that the original lecture was misplaced in order for him to hear about more evidence that the biblical account of creation and the flood, which according to the scriptures happened to be about 4,500 years ago, was not so improbable as he first thought. Once again, God had taken up Walter's "then show me" challenge to reveal to this unbelieving Thomas an entirely new spectrum on life, one that would radically change his thinking forever. After a few weeks of intense study of the theory of evolution, but with new eyes, he was able to detect a multitude of errors that are taught as straight facts in the textbooks, both in schools and at the tertiary level. He even discovered the problems with radiometric dating, realizing that it was possible that everything wasn't as old as they claimed after all. With shame, he remembered how he belittled and embarrassed the students who dared to stand up for the biblical creation account. In a few days, he was to lead out in a discussion with the entire academic staff and the postgraduate students, and he knew this was an opportunity to try and redeem his actions of the past. But he shuddered as he thought of his hardened atheist colleagues' reaction if he showed them that their illustrious castle was built on sand. The day arrived when he had to face some of the most well-known and respected zoologists and paleontologists in the country. Walter stood up and started to present his findings to the group. tentatively at first, but after a while, with a hitherto unknown power, every listener was shaken to the core. An awkward silence fell upon the group of scientists, and then pandemonium broke loose. One of the professors swore and threw his pen at Walter. Another started to scream at the top of his voice, literally foaming at the mouth, while others were slinging insults from a safer distance. Then, one of the postgraduate students stood up. Instead of addressing Walter, she looked at the lecturers and said, almost sadly, "When I came to this institute, I believed in God. But after learning about evolution, I stopped believing. Now, Dr. Veith showed me that what you have taught us wasn't based on fact at all, but on assumption. You have robbed me of my faith." Bathed in perspiration, Walter managed to slip out unnoticed and return to his office, relieved to leave the noisy hornet's nest behind him. He was now more convinced than ever that God was preparing him to face the momentous and eternal battle between truth and error. Little did he know that this was but the beginning, merely the tiniest tip of the iceberg, and that much hardship and pain would follow after he took the first step to unravel and uncover deception in its myriad of forms. Relations at work deteriorated rapidly, and Walter realized he couldn't teach his classes with the same enthusiasm as before. He wanted to shout out to the students that evolution was a deception, but he knew he couldn't. It was spelt out to him in no uncertain terms that there was no place for a creationist in his department. Theistic evolutionists were still acceptable. In fact, many of his colleagues would faithfully go to the Dutch Reformed Church on Sundays, serving as deacons or elders and teaching their children about Noah and his ark. But during the week, they would, with equal comfort, slip into the Church of Evolution and worship their other god. They accepted evolution as the mechanism through which God worked to establish everything on earth. Such a compromise used natural selection and death as the creating force, whereas the Bible states that everything was created perfect and that death only entered the world after the moral fall of man. It was clearly impossible to marry the two. After agonizing over his problem, he decided to resign. He knew that this meant the end of his career that he had worked so hard for, and saying goodbye to the teaching profession and interaction with the students which he loved. It also meant the end of his credibility as a scientist, or so he thought. When the acting rector at the time received his resignation, he called Walter to his office and asked him why he resigned. Walter explained the situation to him and was promptly offered a promotion to professorship if he stayed, but with the understanding that he wouldn't rock the evolutionary boat, nor Noah's Ark for that matter. But he had made up his mind. He knew his life would be hell in a department filled with so much animosity towards him. The rector nodded pensively, but as Walter was about to leave, he asked, "Tell me, Dr. Veith, who do you think has the truth?" Totally unprepared for such a question, Walter squirmed as he tried to avoid getting into a religious discussion with an academic. He tried to explain to him the history of the Protestant that broke free from Catholicism with their creed sola scriptura, the Bible and the Bible alone. But the rector interrupted him and said, "What I mean is, which denomination has the truth today?" For an ex-Catholic atheist scientist, this was the most difficult challenge of his life. He took a deep breath and said, "I believe there is only one remaining denomination on this earth that holds the Bible and fulfills all the criteria as given in Revelation 12:17. And that is, according to my research, the Seventh-day Adventist Church." The rector nodded slowly, and then, without pursuing the issue further, greeted Walter and wished him well for his future. One small step for Walter, one giant step for a totally oblivious mankind that had never experienced the intensity of a passionate, unquenchable German on a mission to uncover even more of this hidden treasure. The end of chapter 5 of Dwelling in the Secret Place.